This is the lecture on scoring terminology used in assessment in special education. My name is Dr. George Giuliani from Hofstra University, and this lecture will focus on the different terms that you need to understand when doing the scoring of your results when it comes to the assessment of a child for suspected disability. Now, the first term you need to understand is the term known as the basal. Now, in every single test that we use in special education, we need to know where are we going to start the administration of the test. For example, do we start at number 1? Do we start at number 10? Do we start at number 30? For example, on a word reading test, there might be 200 different words, but the basal is where we're going to start because it represents the level of mastery, a task of below which the student would correctly answer all the items on a test. So we would assume, for example, that a fourth grader could start at number 30 or number 60, depending on what the test actually offers. So all of the items prior to the basal are not given to the student because they are considered already correct. So, for example, on an IQ test, the examiner may start with question 14 because of the age of the child. That's the basal. So if we start with number 14, the student gets credit for the first 13 questions. So every time you administer a test, you need to know where is it that I'm starting, because many tests have an age range, let's say from like 6 to 16 years of age. Well, we're not going to start a test for a 6-year-old in the same spot where we would start it for a 13-year-old or a 16-year-old. So all of the items prior to the basal we don't give to the student. We just start wherever we're supposed to start. But then the ones before that are considered correct. So for example, if we're supposed to start at number 40, then the first 39 questions are considered correct. And that's what we consider the basal. So make sure when you administer tests in special education, make sure you know where you're going to start the administration of the testing, and that is considered the basal, the starting point. Now, once you determine the basal, you start administering the actual test. But you administer the test until the student reaches what we call a ceiling. And a ceiling is the point where the student has made a predetermined number of errors. And therefore, we stop administering all of the other items on the test because it's assumed that the student will continue to get the answers wrong. So, for example, the ceiling is the point where we say, that's enough. We don't think that the student can get any more correct. So on many different tests, for example, we will have a situation where it will say, administer the items, but once the student gets 10 consecutive answers incorrect, stop administering the actual test. So the ceiling is considered the ending point. It represents the level of mastery of a task above which the student would incorrectly answer all future items on a test. So for example, on a spelling test, the child got numbers 15 to 24 wrong, and we know that the ceiling is 10 incorrect in a row. This would mean the examiner would stop administering the spelling words to the child because the ceiling has already been obtained. So what's the bottom line here in all of this? The bottom line here is this. You need to know every time you administer a test or a subtest to a child, you need to first know where do we start. That's our basal. But you also need to know when do we stop. How many wrong in a row, how many incorrect does a student need to get before we say that's enough? And that's considered our ceiling because that's the ending point. So we have a starting point, which is the basal, and we have an ending point, which is the ceiling. Now, once you administer a test, the first step in scoring it will almost always be to calculate the number of correct items that the child actually got. So, for example, if a student took a 20-question spelling test in your class, the first thing you would do is determine how many words did the kid get correctly. Did he get 16 correct? Did he get 17 correct? How many words did the child actually get correctly? And this is known as a raw score. And the raw score normally indicates the number of items correctly answered on a given test. And in almost all cases, it's the first score a teacher obtains when interpreting any kind of data, because it's what we look for. How many did the child get correct? But the issue with the raw score is that it's a test score that hasn't been weighted. It hasn't been transformed. It hasn't been statistically manipulated in any way. So raw scores by themselves generally mean very little. So for example, suppose a student in your class got 18 out of 20 correct on the spelling test. The number 18 really has no meaning. 18, getting 18 out of 20 correct and saying you got 18 doesn't really tell us anything. But what matters is what you do with that 18. So for example, most teachers would say, well, you got 18 out of 20. We'll turn that into a percentage, and we'll say 18 out of 20 is a 90% on the test, and you know that you got a 90. So the first thing we always have to do is calculate the raw score of the child. How many words did the child read correctly? How many spelling words did the child spell correctly? How many math problems did the child answer correctly? So when you're administering an academic achievement test, the first thing you'll often have to do is calculate the raw score. But those raw scores by themselves don't tell us very much. We have to take raw scores and manipulate them and transform them into scores that will actually mean something, that will actually make sense. And that's what we're going to do next. Next, we're going to talk about converting raw scores into other types of scores that have actual meaning. And that will end part 1 of our scoring terminology lecture. You can go on to part 2 now.